Goodbye, Mr. Chips. Written by James Hilton. Narrated by Daniel Natal. Chapter 1. When you are getting on in years, but not ill of course, you get very sleepy at times, and the hours seem to pass like lazy cattle moving across a landscape. It was like that for Chips as the autumn term progressed and the days shortened till it was actually dark enough to light the gas before call-over. For Chips, like some old sea captain, still measured time by the signals of the past. And well mighty, for he lived at Mrs. Wickett's just across the road from the school. He had been there for more than a decade, ever since he finally gave up his mastership. And it was Brookfield far more than Greenwich time that both he and his landlady kept. Mrs. Wickett, Chips would sing out in that jerky high-pitched voice that still had a good deal of sprightliness in it. You might bring me a cup of tea before prep, will you? When you are getting on in years, it is nice to sit by the fire and drink a cup of tea and listen to the school bell sounding dinner, call-over, prep, and lights out. Chips always wound up the clock after the last bell. Then he put the wire guard in front of the fire, turned out the gas, and carried a detective novel to bed. Rarely did he read more than a page of it before sleep came swiftly and peacefully, more like a mystic intensifying of perception than any changeful entrance into another world, for his days and nights were equally full of dreaming. He was getting on in years, but not ill, of course. Indeed, as Dr. Merivale said, there was really nothing the matter with him. "My dear fellow, you're fitter than I am," Merivale would say, sipping a glass of sherry when he called every fortnight or so. "You're past the age when people get these horrible diseases. You're one of the few lucky ones who are going to die a really natural death. That is, of course, if you die at all. You're such a remarkable old boy that one never knows." But when Chips had a cold or when east winds roared over the fenlands, Merivale would sometimes take Mrs. Wickett aside in the lobby and whisper, "Look after him, you know. His chest. It puts a strain on his heart. Nothing really wrong with him. Only anno domini. But that's the most fatal complaint of all in the end. Anno Domini, by Jove, yes. Born in 1848 and taken to the Great Exhibition as a toddling child. Not many people alive could still boast a thing like that. Besides, Chips could even remember Brookfield in Weatherby's time. A phenomenon that was. Weatherby had been an old man in those days. 1870. Easy to remember because of the Franco-Prussian War. Chips had put in for Brookfield after a year at Melbury, which he hadn't liked, because he had been ragged there a good deal. But Brookfield he had liked, almost from the beginning. He remembered that day of his preliminary interview. Sunny June, with the air full of flower scents and the plick-plock of cricket on the pitch. Brookfield was playing Barnhurst, and one of the Barnhurst boys, a chubby little fellow, made a brilliant century. Queer that a thing like that should stay in the memory so clearly. Weatherby himself was very fatherly and courteous. He must have been ill then, poor chap, for he died during the summer vacation before Chips began his first term. But the two had seen and spoken to each other anyway. Chips often thought, as he sat by the fire at Mrs. Wickett's, I am probably the only man in the world who has a vivid recollection of old Weatherby. Vivid, yes. It was a frequent picture in his mind, that summer day with the sunlight filtering through the dust in Weatherby's study. You are a young man, Mr. Chipping, and Brookfield is an old foundation. Youth and age often combine well. Give your enthusiasm to Brookfield, and Brookfield will give you something in return. And don't let anyone play tricks with you. I gather that discipline was not always your strong point at Melbury. Well, no, perhaps not, sir. Never mind, you're full young. It's largely a matter of experience. You have another chance here. Take up a firm attitude from the beginning. That's the secret of it. Perhaps it was. He remembered that first tremendous ordeal of taking prep, a September sunset more than half a century ago. Big hall full of lusty barbarians ready to pounce on him as their legitimate prey. His youth, fresh-complexioned, high-collared, and side-whiskered, odd fashions people followed in those days, at the mercy of 500 unprincipled ruffians to whom the baiting of new masters was a fine art. An exciting sport and something of a tradition. Decent little beggars individually, but as a mob, just pitiless and implacable. The sudden hush as he took his place at the desk on the dais, the scowl he assumed to cover his inward nervousness, the tall clock ticking behind him and the smells of ink and varnish, the last blood-red rays slanting in slabs through the stained-glass windows. Someone dropped a desk lid. Quickly he must take everybody by surprise. He must show that there was no nonsense about him. "You there, in the fifth row. You with the red hair. What's your name?" "Collie, sir." "Very well, Collie. You have 100 lines." No trouble at all after that. He had won his first round. And years later, when Collie was an alderman of the city of London and a baronet and various other things, he sent his son, also red-haired, to Brookfield, and Chips would say, "Collie, your father was the first boy I ever punished when I came here 25 years ago. He deserved it then, and you deserve it now." How they all laughed. And how Sir Richard laughed when his son wrote home the story in next Sunday's letter. And again years after that, many years after that, there was an even better joke. For another collie had just arrived, son of the collie who was the son of the first collie. And Chips would say, punctuating his remarks with that little umph that had by then become a habit with him, "Collie, umph." A splendid example of inherited traditions. I remember your grandfather would never grasp the ablative absolute. A stupid fellow, your grandfather, and your father too. I remember him. He used to sit at that far desk by the wall. He wasn't much better either. But I do believe, my dear collie, that you are the biggest fool of the lot. Roars of laughter. A great joke, this growing old, but a sad joke too in a way. And as Chip sat by his fire with autumn gales rattling the windows, the waves of humor and sadness swept over him very often until tears fell, so that when Mrs. Wicket came in with his cup of tea, she did not know whether he had been laughing or crying, and neither did Chips himself. Chapter 2. Across the road behind a rampart of ancient elms lay Brookfield, russet under its autumn mantle of creeper. A group of 18th century buildings centered upon a quadrangle, and there were acres of playing fields beyond. Then came the small dependent village and the open fen country. Brookfield, as Weatherby had said, was an old foundation. Established in the reign of Elizabeth as a grammar school, it might, with better luck, have become as famous as Harrow. Its luck, however, had been not so good. The school went up and down, dwindling almost to non-existence at one time, becoming almost illustrious at another. It was during one of these latter periods, in the reign of the first George, that the main structure had been rebuilt and large additions made. Later, after the Napoleonic Wars and mid-Victorian days, the school declined again, both in numbers and in repute. Weatherby, who came in 1840, restored his fortunes somewhat, but its subsequent history never raised it to front-rank status. It was, nevertheless, a good school of the second rank. Several notable families supported it. It supplied fair samples of the history-making men of the age: judges, members of parliament, colonial administrators, a few peers and bishops. Mostly, however, it turned out merchants, manufacturers, and professional men with a good sprinkling of country squires and parsons. It was the sort of school which, when mentioned, would sometimes make snobbish people confess that they rather thought they had heard of it. But if it had not been this sort of school, it probably would not have taken Chips. For Chips, in any social or academic sense, was just as respectable, but no more brilliant, than Brookfield itself. It had taken him some time to realize this at the beginning. Not that he was boastful or conceited, but he had been in his early 20s as ambitious as most other young men at such an age. His dream had been to get a headship eventually, or at any rate a senior mastership in a really first-class school. It was only gradually, after repeated trials and failures, that he realized the inadequacy of his qualifications. His degree, for instance, was not particularly good, and his discipline, though good enough and improving, was not absolutely reliable under all conditions. He had no private means and no family connections of any importance. About 1880, after he'd been at Brookfield a decade, he began to recognize that the odds were heavily against his being able to better himself by moving elsewhere. But about that time also, the possibility of staying where he was began to fill a comfortable niche in his mind. At 40, he was rooted, settled, and quite happy. At 50, he was the doyen of the staff. At 60, under a new and youthful head, he was Brookfield, the guest of honor at old Brookfieldian dinners, the court of appeal in all matters affecting Brookfield history and traditions. And in 1913, when he turned 65, he retired, was presented with a check and a writing desk and a clock, and went across the road to live at Mrs. Wicket's. A decent career, decently closed. 3 cheers for old Chips, they all shouted at that uproarious end-of-term dinner. 3 cheers indeed. But there was more to come, an unguessed epilogue, an encore, played to a tragic audience. Chapter 3. It was a small but very comfortable and sunny room that Mrs. Wicket let to him. The house itself was ugly and pretentious, but that didn't matter. It was convenient. That was the main thing. For he liked, if the weather were mild enough, to stroll across to the playing fields in the afternoon and watch the games. He liked to smile and exchange a few words with the boys when they touched their caps to him. He made a special point to get to know all the new boys and having them to tea with him during their first term. He always ordered a walnut cake with pink icing from Redaway's in the village, and during the winter term there were crumpets too. A little pile of them in front of the fire, soaked in butter so that the bottom one lay in a little shallow pool. His guests found it fun to watch him make tea, mixing careful spoonfuls from different caddies, and he would ask the new boys where they lived and if they had family connections at Brookfield. He kept watch to see that their plates were never empty, and punctually at 5, after the session had lasted an hour, he would glance at the clock and say, "Well, it's been very delightful meeting you like this. I'm sorry you can't stay." And he would smile and shake hands with them in the porch, leaving them to race across the road to the school with their comments. Decent old boy, Chips. Gives you a jolly good tea anyhow. And you do know when he wants you to push off. And Chips also would be making his comments to Mrs. Wickett when she entered the room to clear away the remains of the party. A most interesting time, Mrs. Wickett. Young Branksome tells me that his uncle was Major Collingwood. The Collingwood we had here in Knot 2, I think it was. Dear me, I remember Collingwood very well. I once thrashed him for climbing on top of the gymnasium roof to get a ball out of the gutter. Might have broken his neck, the young fool. Do you remember him, Mrs. Wickett? He must have been in your time. Mrs. Wickett, before she saved money, had been in charge of the linen room at the school. Yes, I knew him, sir. Cheeky he was to me generally. But we never had no bad words between us, just cheeky-like. He never meant no harm. That kind never does, sir. Wasn't it him that got that medal, sir? Yes, a DSO. Will you be wanting anything else, sir? Nothing for now, until chapel time. He was killed. In Egypt, I think. Yes, you can bring my supper about then. Very good, sir. A pleasant, placid life at Mrs. Wickett's. He had no worries, his pension was adequate, and there was a little money saved up besides. He could afford everything and anything he wanted. His room was furnished simply and with schoolmasterly taste. A few bookshelves and sporting trophies. A mantelpiece crowded with fixture cards and signed photographs of boys and men. A worn turkey carpet. Big easy chairs. Pictures on the wall of the Acropolis and the Forum. Nearly everything had come out of his old housemaster's room and schoolhouse. The books were chiefly classical, the classics having been his subject. There was, however, a seasoning of history and belles-lettres. There was also a bottom shelf piled up with cheap editions of detective novels. Chips enjoyed these. Sometimes he took down Virgil or Xenophon and read for a few moments, but he was soon back again with Dr. Thorndyke or Inspector French. He was not, despite his long years of assiduous teaching, a very profound classical scholar. Indeed, he thought of Latin and Greek far more as dead languages from which English gentlemen ought to know a few quotations than as living tongues that had ever been spoken by living people. He liked those short leading articles in the Times that introduced a few tags that he recognized. To be among the dwindling number of people who understood such things was to him a kind of secret and valued Freemasonry. It represented, he felt, one of the chief benefits to be derived from a classical education. So here he lived at Mrs. Wickett's with his quiet enjoyments of reading and talking and remembering. An old man, white-haired and only a little bald, still fairly active for his years, drinking tea, receiving callers, busying himself with corrections for the next edition of the Brookfieldian Directory, writing his occasional letters in thin, spidery but very legible script. He had new masters to tea as well as new boys. There were 2 of them that autumn term, and as they were leaving after their visit, one of them commented, "Quite a character, the old boy, isn't he? All that fuss about mixing the tea. A typical bachelor if there ever was one." Which was oddly incorrect, because Chips was not a bachelor at all. He had married, though it was so long ago that none of the staff at Brookfield could remember his wife. Chapter 4. There came to him, stirred by the warmth of the fire and the gentle aroma of tea, 1,000 tangled recollections of old times. Spring, the spring of 1896. He was 48, an age at which a permanence of habits begins to be predictable. He had just been appointed housemaster. With this and his classical forms, he had made for himself a warm and busy corner of life. During the summer vacation, he went up to the Lake District with Rowden, a colleague. They walked and climbed for a week until Rowden had to leave suddenly on some family business. Chip stayed alone at Wasdale Head, where he boarded in a small farmhouse. One day, climbing on Great Gable, he noticed a girl waving excitedly from a dangerous-looking ledge. Thinking she was in difficulties, he hastened toward her, but in doing so slipped himself and wrenched his ankle. As it turned out, she was not in difficulties at all, but was merely signaling to a friend farther down the mountain. She was an expert climber, better even than Chips, who was pretty good. Thus he found himself the rescued instead of the rescuer, and neither role was one for which he had much relish. For he did not, he would have said, care for women. He never felt at home or at ease with them. And that monstrous creature beginning to be talked about, the new woman of the 90s, filled him with horror. He was a quiet, conventional person, and the world, viewed from the haven of Brookfield, seemed to him full of distasteful innovations. There was a fellow named Bernard Shaw who had the strangest and most reprehensible opinions. There was Ibsen, too, with his disturbing plays. And there was this new craze for bicycling, which was being taken up by women equally with men. Chips did not hold with all this modern newness and freedom. He had a vague notion, if he ever formulated it, that nice women were weak, timid, and delicate, and that nice men treated them with a polite but rather distant chivalry. He had not therefore expected to find a woman on Great Gable, but having encountered one who seemed to need masculine help, it was even more terrifying that she would turn the tables by helping him. For she did. She and her friend had to. He could scarcely walk, and it was a hard job getting him down the steep track to Wasdale. Her name was Catherine Bridges. She was 25, young enough to be Chips's daughter. She had blue flashing eyes and freckled cheeks and smooth straw-colored hair. She too was staying at a farm on holiday with a girlfriend, and as she considered herself responsible for Chips's accident, she used to bicycle along the side of the lake to the house in which the quiet, middle-aged, serious-looking man lay resting. That was how she thought of him at first. And he, because she rode a bicycle and was unafraid to visit a man alone in a farmhouse sitting room, wondered vaguely what the world was coming to. His sprain put him at her mercy, and it was soon revealed to him how much he might need that mercy. She was a governess out of a job with a little money saved up. She read and admired Ibsen. She believed that women ought to be admitted to the universities. She even thought they ought to have a vote. In politics, she was a radical, with leanings towards the views of people like Bernard Shaw and William Morris. All her ideas and opinions she poured out to Chips during those summer afternoons at Wasdale Head. And he, because he was not very articulate, did not at first think it worthwhile to contradict them. Her friend went away, but she stayed. What could you do with such a person, Chips thought. He used to hobble with sticks along the footpath leading to the tiny church. There was a stone slab on the wall, and it was comfortable to sit down facing the sunlight and the green-brown majesty of the gable and listening to the chatter of, well, yes, Chips had to admit it, a very beautiful girl. He had never met anyone like her. He had always thought that the modern type, this new woman business, would repel him. And here she was, making him positively look forward to the glimpse of her safety bicycle careering along the lakeside road. And she too had never met anyone like him. She had always thought that middle-aged gentlemen who read the Times and disapproved of modernity were terrible bores. Yet here he was, claiming her interest and attention far more than youths of her own age. She liked him, initially because he was so hard to get to know, because he had gentle and quiet manners, because his opinions dated from those utterly impossible 70s and 80s and even earlier, yet were for all that so thoroughly honest, and because his eyes were brown and he looked charming when he smiled. Of course, I shall call you Chips too, she said, when she learned that was his nickname at school. Within a week, they were head over heels in love. Before Chips could walk without a stick, they considered themselves engaged, and they were married in London a week before the beginning of the autumn term. Chapter 5. When Chips, dreaming through the hours at Mrs. Wickett's, recollected those days, he used to look down at his feet and wonder which one it was that had performed so signal a service. That, the trivial cause of so momentous happenings, was the one thing of which details evaded him. But he resaw the glorious hump of the gable. He had never visited the Lake District since, and the mouse-gray depths of Wastwater under the screes. He could re-smell the washed air after heavy rain, and re-follow the ribbon of the pass across to Styhead. So clearly it lingered, that time of dizzy happiness, those evening strolls by the waterside, her cool voice and her gay laughter. She had been a very happy person, always. They had both been so eager, planning a future together. But he had been rather serious about it, even a little odd. It would be all right, of course, her coming to Brookfield. Other housemasters were married, and she liked boys, she told him, and would enjoy living among them. Oh, Chips, I'm so glad you are what you are. I was afraid you were a solicitor or a stockbroker or a dentist or a man with a big cotton business in Manchester, when I first met you, I mean. Schoolmastering's so different, so important, don't you think? To be influencing those who are going to grow up and matter to the world. Chip said he hadn't thought of it like that, or at least not often. He did his best. That was all anyone can do in any job. Yes, of course, Chips. I do love you for saying simple things like that. And one morning, another memory gemmed clear when he turned to it. He had for some reason been afflicted with an acute desire to depreciate himself and all his attainments. He told her of his only mediocre degree, of his occasional difficulties of discipline, of the certainty that he would never get a promotion, and of his complete ineligibility to marry a young and ambitious girl. And at the end of it all, she had laughed in answer. She had no parents and was married from the house of an aunt in Ealing. On the night before the wedding, when Chips left the house to return to his hotel, she said, with mock gravity, "This is an occasion, you know. This last farewell of ours. I feel rather like a new boy beginning his first term with you. Not scared, mind you, but just for once in a thoroughly respectful mood. Shall I call you sir? Or would Mr. Chips be the right thing? Mr. Chips, I think. Goodbye, then. Goodbye, Mr. Chips." A hansom clip-clopping in the roadway. Green pale gas lamps flickering on a wet pavement. Newsboy shouting something about South Africa. Sherlock Holmes in Baker Street. Goodbye, Mr. Chips. Chapter 6. There had followed then a time of such happiness that Chips, remembering it long afterward, hardly believed it could ever have happened before or since in the world, for his marriage was a triumphant success. Catherine conquered Brookfield as she had conquered Chips. She was immensely popular with boys and masters alike. Even the wives of the masters, tempted at first to be jealous of one so young and lovely, could not long resist her charms. But most remarkable of all was the change she made in Chips. Till his marriage he had been a dry and rather neutral sort of person, liked and thought well of by Brookfield in general, but not of the stuff that makes for great popularity or that stirs great affection. He had been at Brookfield for over a quarter of a century, long enough to have established himself as a decent fellow and a hard worker, but just too long for anyone to believe him capable of ever being much more. He had in fact already begun to sink into that creeping dry rot of pedagogy which is the worst and ultimate pitfall of the profession. Giving the same lessons year after year had formed a groove into which the other affairs of his life adjusted themselves with insidious ease. He worked well. He was conscientious. He was a fixture that gave service, satisfaction, confidence, everything except inspiration. And then came this astonishing girl-wife whom nobody had expected, least of all Chips himself. She made him to all appearances a new man, though most of the newness was really a warming to life of things that were old, imprisoned, and unguessed. His eyes gained sparkle. His mind, which was adequately if not brilliantly equipped, began to move more adventurously. The one thing he had always had, his sense of humor, blossomed into a sudden richness to which his years lent maturity. He began to feel a great sureness. His discipline improved to a point at which it could become, in a sense, less rigid. He became more popular. When he had first come to Brookfield, he had aimed to be loved, honored, and obeyed, but obeyed at any rate. Obedience he had secured, and honor had been granted him. But only now came love, the sudden love of boys for a man who was kind without being soft, who understood them well enough, but not too much, and whose private happiness linked them with their own. He began to make little jokes, the sort that schoolboys like, mnemonics and puns that raised laughs and at the same time imprinted something in the mind. There was one that never failed to please, though it was only a sample of many others. Whenever his Roman history forms came to deal with the lex canolea, the law that permitted patricians to marry plebeians, Chips used to add, so that you see, if Miss Plebs wanted Mr. Patrician to marry her, and he said he couldn't, she probably replied, "Oh yes, you can, you liar." Roars of laughter. And Cathy broadened his views and opinions also, giving him an outlook far beyond the roofs and turrets of Brookfield, so that he saw his country as something deep and gracious to which Brookfield was but one of many feeding streams. She had a cleverer brain than his, and he could not confuse her ideas even if and when he disagreed with them. He remained, for instance, a conservative in politics, despite all her radical socialist talk. But even where he did not accept, he absorbed. Her young idealism worked upon his maturity to produce an amalgam very gentle and wise. Sometimes she persuaded him completely. Brookfield, for example, ran a mission in East London to which boys and parents contributed generously with money but rarely with personal contact. It was Catherine who suggested that a team from the mission should come up to Brookfield to play one of the school's 11s at soccer. The idea was so revolutionary that from anyone but Catherine it could not have survived its first frosty reception. To introduce a group of slum boys to the serene pleasances of better-class youngsters seemed at first a wanton stirring of all kinds of things that had better be left untouched. The whole staff was against it, and the school, if its opinion could have been taken, was probably against it too. Everyone was certain that the East End lads would be hooligans, or else that they would be made to feel uncomfortable. Anyhow, there would be incidents, and everyone would be confused and upset. Yet Catherine persisted. "Chips," she said, "they're wrong, you know, and I'm right. I'm looking ahead to the future. They and you are looking back to the past. England isn't always going to be divided into officers and other ranks. And those Poplar boys are just as important to England as Brookfield is. You've got to have them here, Chips. You can't satisfy your conscience by writing a check for a few guineas and keeping them at arm's length. Besides, they're proud of Brookfield, just as you are. Years hence, maybe, boys of that sort will be coming here. A few of them at any rate. Why not? Why ever not? Chips, dear, remember, this is 1897, not 67 when you were up at Cambridge. You got your ideas stuck in those days, and good ideas they were too, a lot of them. But a few, just a few, Chips, one unsticking." Rather to her surprise, he gave way and suddenly became a keen advocate of the proposal. And the volte-face was so complete that authorities were taken unawares and found themselves consenting to the dangerous experiment. The boys from Poplar arrived at Brookfield one Saturday afternoon, played soccer with the school's second team, were honorably defeated by 7-5, and later had high tea with the school team in the dining hall. They then met the head and were shown over the school, and Chip saw them off at the railway station in the evening. Everything had passed without the slightest hitch of any kind, and it was clear that the visitors were taking away with them as fine an impression as they had left behind. They took back with them also the memory of a charming woman who had met them and talked to them. For once, years later, during the war, a private stationed at a big military camp near Brookfield called on Chips and said he had been one of that first visiting team. Chips gave him tea and chatted with him till at length, shaking hands, the man said, "And how's the missus, sir? I remember her very well." "Do you?" Chips answered eagerly. "Do you remember her?" "Rather, I should think anyone would." And Chips replied, "They don't, you know. At least not here. Boys come and go, new faces all the time. Memories don't last. Even masters don't stay forever. Since last year, when old Gribble retired, he's, the school butler, there hasn't been anyone here who ever saw my wife. She died, you know, less than a year after your visit, in '98. I'm really sorry to hear that, sir. There's 2 or 3 of my pals anyhow who remember her clear as anything, though we did only see her that once. Yes, we remember her all right. I'm very glad. That was a grand day we all had. And a fine game, too. One of the best days that I ever had in my life. Wish it was then and not now. Straight I do. I'm off to France tomorrow." A month or so later, Chips heard that he had been killed at Passchendaele.